All right, let's talk Cleveland. And no, I'm not going down the Deshaun Watson rabbit hole today. Look, if you've been following this franchise for more than 5 minutes, you already know how that whole saga is going to play out, no matter how much the organization keeps tiptoeing around it in press conferences and carefully worded statements. And I'm definitely not here to rehash the same tired trade rumors that keep popping up on your timeline every few weeks like clockwork. Rumors that, by the way, have zero actual supporting evidence behind them. None. Zip. What I am here to talk about is something I stumbled across this week while digging through practice footage. And I mean really digging. This wasn't something that came gift-wrapped with a catchy headline. Nobody sent a press release about it. It didn't pop up on the transaction wire. This was the kind of thing that made me hit pause mid-clip, rewind, watch it again, then watch it a third time, because what I was seeing didn't feel like the usual fluff teams put out there to keep their content machines humming along. The more I sat with it, the more I realized something important. The biggest story coming out of Cleveland minicamp right now has almost nothing to do with any one player's performance on any given rep. It has everything to do with what those performances, when you zoom out and look at them together, reveal about the kind of organization being quietly built inside that building. So let's get into it, properly, no rushing. First things first, though. Before we go any further, let's set the right frame for this conversation. Because if we get the frame wrong, everything that follows just becomes another pile of off-season noise dressed up in fancy analytical clothing. Minicamp is helmets and shorts. Full stop. There's no live pass rush breathing down anybody's neck. There's no real competitive chaos. No defensive backs fighting tooth and nail for their roster spots with the kind of raw desperation that genuinely changes how a quarterback processes reads, or how a receiver battles through contact at the top of a route when the stakes are actually real. Anyone trying to hand you definitive conclusions from 3 days of glorified controlled walkthroughs is either not paying close enough attention, or they've got something to gain from making you feel certain about something you absolutely shouldn't be certain about yet. I want to be straight with you about that from the jump. But here's the thing. Minicamp still tells you something real, if you know exactly which signals are worth paying attention to. It shows you physical readiness, it shows you positional ceiling, and most importantly, it gives you proof of what I like to call private preparation. All those invisible months of grinding in empty facilities long before any camera crew showed up. Because that kind of behind-the-scenes work has a funny way of announcing itself very loudly the moment a player steps into any serious professional evaluation. It doesn't hide well. It never does. That's the lens I'm bringing to this. And Cleveland gave me a lot to look at through it. Quick pause. If you're a die-hard Browns fan like me and you've been locked into everything coming out of Cleveland this offseason, drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I genuinely want to hear from you. And honestly, I believe this is our year. I believe we're going to be standing on that Super Bowl stage before this season is over. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and let's keep building this community together. Now back to it. Let's talk about Denzel Ward. Actually, scratch that. Let's talk about Denzel Boston, and let's give him the kind of real, unhurried attention he genuinely deserves. I'm not going to squeeze his evaluation into a single throwaway line inside some depth chart breakdown, because I think this guy is significantly more important to what this offense can actually become than the amount of national coverage he's getting right now would have you believe. The physical profile hits you the moment the footage starts rolling. He's long. He fills out that outside receiver position with a kind of presence, a commanding, take-up space presence that this offense has been quietly missing for long enough that most people have just stopped noticing the hole. You get used to the absence after a while. The Josh Gordon comparison started flying around almost immediately after the first clip made the rounds online, and honestly, I get it completely. A boundary receiver who physically imposes himself on a route, who forces defensive coordinators to actually think twice, who demands real coverage attention rather than the kind of comfortable, half-hearted soft shade that corners freely hand out to receivers they don't genuinely respect. Who makes defenses react to him rather than just sitting back and waiting to see what the offense decides to do? That type of player fills a specific, real, and long-standing void. This offense has been dragging that void around like a ball and chain for years, and Boston's physical profile addresses it head-on, no qualifications needed. But the physical stuff? That's not actually the story. The route tape is where the real story lives, and it keeps getting reduced to one lazy evaluative sentence when it deserves a whole lot more careful thought than that. Boston wasn't winning those minicamp reps on size alone. He wasn't just using his frame to bully defensive backs around and manufacture separation through sheer physical bullying. What he was showing, at an early developmental stage where his technical refinement is clearly still being assembled piece by piece, was genuine route intelligence. He was using his frame to create positional leverage before his breaks, not after them. He was planting tendencies in his release stems and then executing cuts that directly contradicted what he'd been showing the coverage earlier in the same drill. He was processing pre-snap and adjusting en route in a way that separates receivers who genuinely understand what this position demands at a professional level from athletic profiles who are still figuring out what the position even fundamentally is, route. Sophistication like that doesn't just appear out of nowhere on day one of a professional evaluation. A coaching staff can't install it in 3 days of walkthrough sessions while they're still learning last names. That gets built through months of deliberate, solitary, unglamorous work, empty facilities, private coaching sessions, rep after rep after rep in environments where nothing gets filmed, and the only thing pushing the work forward is an internal reckoning with what the opportunity actually requires. Boston walked into Cleveland with that work already done, and it was visible. It's always visible. The first time a genuinely prepared player steps into a professional setting. For Shedeur Sanders, the operational implications here are real and concrete. The most persistent structural limitation on this offense has been the absence of a boundary receiver who wins reliably. Enough on the outside to actually force defensive coordinators to commit serious coverage, resources to the perimeter. The kind of commitment that creates downstream breathing room in the intermediate zones, exactly where a precision quarterback's accuracy and willingness to attack tight windows can be maximized. Boston's combination of physical presence and developing route intelligence, alongside Shedeur's already documented accuracy, creates a genuine coverage problem that this offense simply hasn't been capable of generating for a long time. And when you start to see what that unlocks, in play calling freedom, in third down conversion rates, in what becomes possible in the fourth quarter of close games when defenses can no longer preset their entire coverage structure around one obvious target, the importance of what Boston brings starts to look a whole lot bigger than the headlines are giving him credit. 4. Casey conception. Let's be honest about both sides of this, because the comfortable version and the accurate version are not the same thing, and you deserve the full picture. The drops were a real problem. I'm not going to soften that by hiding behind minicamp context. Drops in professional football are not just negative statistical events. They're psychological events with lasting consequences. Every time a receiver fails to secure a catchable ball, it creates friction between him and his quarterback that echoes well beyond the play itself. It quietly influences play calling in ways that never appear in any official game plan document. And over time, it chips away at the operational trust a quarterback has to carry in a target. The trust required to commit to him when coverage is tight and the game is genuinely on the line. Conception's hands need to reach a significantly more reliable standard. Anything softer than that is a disservice to honest evaluation, so there it is. But here's the thing. Reducing the entire conception picture to just the drops conversation is its own kind of analytical failure. The route tape demands a completely separate accounting, the way he was already processing his releases off the line. The movement concepts being applied through the stems of his roots before his breaks arrived. The sharpness he was generating at the top of his cuts, real quickness, not telegraphed athleticism that a defensive back can read and anticipate in time. There was a touchdown connection in those sessions where the separation happened because the route concept functioned correctly against the coverage he had identified pre-snap, not because he outran anyone, because the route simply worked. And that distinction carries enormous weight when you're trying to project a receiver's professional ceiling. Getting open because a route worked correctly is a fundamentally different statement about a player than getting open because he happened to be faster than whoever was covering him. The first tells you football intelligence is developing at a genuine and meaningful pace. The second just tells you the player is athletic. Conception's minicamp fell clearly into the first category. His feet are already doing things that give a coaching staff real developmental material to work with. The hands need to catch up to everything else. But building on top of a legitimate technical foundation is a meaningfully different situation than having drops stacked on top of nothing. That distinction matters enormously when you're projecting what a player can actually become. Talon Green. I want to address this directly, because I can already feel where certain corners of the coverage are trying to take his minicamp moments. And it needs to be said plainly before that narrative picks up momentum it hasn't earned. The arm talent is real. The mobility creates a dimension that traditional pocket passers simply cannot provide by definition. The physical presence he brought to those early sessions generated genuine excitement, and that excitement deserves acknowledgement. But here's the honest, complete picture. The mechanical release carries a length and looseness that will require sustained, serious refinement to hold up consistently against professional pass rush pressure. He overthrew a tight end. He sailed throws past intended targets in separate sequences. None of that is surprising given the context, and none of it should set off any alarms. Green was a 6th round selection precisely because the ceiling is attached to an extended developmental timeline, and his current floor is exactly where 6th round developmental quarterbacks tend to sit at the beginning of their professional lives. Shedeur. Sanders is who Cleveland is building toward. That conclusion is embedded in every significant resource decision this franchise has made throughout this entire offseason. The offensive line investment, the receiver acquisitions, the structural logic of everything being assembled inside that building. One promising rep in a controlled, padless environment doesn't alter a single element of that architecture. Now, here is where I want to spend real time, because this is genuinely the biggest story coming out of Cleveland minicamp, and it's also the one least likely to get serious analytical attention from the national conversation. Stop looking at the individual pieces. Start looking at the organizational logic that connects them. Boston addresses the boundary receiver absence that has quietly placed a ceiling on this offense's potential for years, not as a projection or a hope, but as an identifiable physical and technical profile arriving with preparation already completed and visible. Conception's movement qualities and route processing sophistication create coverage allocation, pressure in the intermediate zones that generates exactly the kind of operating space where Shedeur has demonstrated the most precision and the most comfort. The rebuilt offensive line represents hundreds of millions of dollars invested deliberately toward creating the protective infrastructure a franchise quarterback needs to actually operate at his ceiling, rather than at whatever compromised, just trying to survive level an unstable front five forces onto him, regardless of how talented he actually is. These are not generic roster moves filling generic roster holes. They are deliberate, specific, purposeful investments in an offensive vision designed around a quarterback's particular skill set, resourced with the seriousness of an organization that genuinely believes in what it's building. That is what intentional franchise building actually looks like from the inside. It's a categorically different process from the transactional roster shuffling that teams stuck in perpetual rebuilding. Cycles tend to produce year after year, and the difference is completely visible in the coherence of the decisions when you examine them together, rather than picking them apart one at a time.